Welcome back, everybody. Just a few announcements as we get going towards the end of the conference here. There will be two handouts coming around. Amiro's got one, I have the other. So the second one will be coming as well. So we'll have our session here, and my colleague Tim will introduce it in a second. Okay, so not on your schedule because Leo just presented it. At 3:30, 3:30, aquí, una conversación informal. So we're gonna have an informal conversation simply about sort of what does it mean to live Romero's vision in our particular contexts. So Rodolfo va a compartir un poco sobre El Salvador, y la situación ahí, y en Peru de Leo. So we'll have a conversation about what's going on in El Salvador and Peru, and we can have time for each of us to share a little bit about what's going on in our own context. So just informal, maybe about an hour. It's just simply if you want to. It's also actually, compared to yesterday, a nice day. So do as you wish. We will have mass at the Basilica after that. So was it 5:15? Okay, 5:15. With our local bishop will be presiding. And he's actually been invited by two groups to come preside, by the Romero group. But also there's a conference at the law school on the death penalty going on right now. So I think he's likely, okay, you never know what a bishop's going to say. But he's most likely going to connect Romero and the death penalty. So issues of violence and nonviolence that we haven't really touched that much on. So that'll be at 5:15, and then everyone is welcome for dinner. And dinner will be next door, that building in Jenkins, Nanovic, at 6:15, 6:30, right after mass. Okay, so I will pass out the second handout, and I'll hand it over to my colleague, Tim. We'll
just pass around the English, and then if you need Spanish, I think everyone, yeah, we'll just pass around the English.
Good afternoon. Nice to see all of you. I'm Timothy Matavina. I'm in the theology department here. So I congratulate those who put this together. It's great and it's not so good to have this conference at Notre Dame. It's great because you're all here. It's difficult because those of us who work here, we miss half the conference because we have classes, expenses, and other stuff. So I see a bunch of friends I haven't even said hello to yet, and I'm sorry I haven't been here. I'll be here the rest of the day. It's wonderful to welcome you all and have you all here. Hope next year, I understand we are going to be in another place, so I won't have classes to teach because I will be away from home as well. So I look forward to that. We have a great panel this afternoon, so I'll go ahead and introduce them and then just let them speak. Eli McCarthy teaches in the Department of Theology and Religious Studies at Georgetown University. His scholarship and advocacy include a focus on our session theme of nonviolence, such as his book, Becoming Nonviolent Peacemakers, alongside extensive policy, grassroots peace-building work with Franciscan Action Network, Fox Christi International, the DC Peace Team. Welcome, great to have you here. Janna Hunter-Bowman is well known around here, having studied with us. She's now Associate Professor of Peace Studies and Christian Social Ethics at Anabaptist Mennonite Biblical Seminary, not far from here. Among her various publications are the book Witnessing Peace, Becoming Agents Under Duress in Colombia, and a current book project, tentatively titled Mobilizing the Dead, Migrant-Led Movements Remember the Crucified Body. And then a response will come today from Fabio Javier Colorado. He's born and raised in El Salvador, did his initial studies at the Universidad Centroamericana, the UCA in El Salvador, and is currently engaged in doctoral studies at the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley. I see Joel Rubio here too, welcome. His research focuses on the homilies of Saint Oscar Romero and the relationship to socio-political transformation and contemporary applications of that. Welcome to all of you. Look forward to your papers and your comment.
All right. Well, it's been a wonderful journey to be with you these last couple of days. It's my first Romero conference. Really been learning with you. So thank you so much for the hospitality. I know it's kind of the last session. Hopefully you had a chance to kind of move a little bit, but need like an extra stretch or something. Now's the time to do it. So we can totally lean in and learn together. In this essay, I'm going to explore Romero's thinking about violence through the lens of accompaniment. We've heard how he's walked a careful pastoral line with those using violence to resist oppression from the government and paramilitaries. So first, I'm going to describe some key aspects of his approach to violence. Second, analyze this approach through his understanding and praxis of accompaniment. And third, kind of consider the implications for such accompaniment to the contemporary kind of Christian discourse around legitimate defense. So, part one, Romero's thinking about violence arises in the context of his ecclesiology. He understands the mission of the church to be of the poor and as the, quote, flesh in which Christ makes present down the ages his own life and personal mission, unquote. In his third pastoral letter, where he's reflecting on the church and popular organizations, Romero identifies 5 aspects of this overall plan of liberation proclaimed by the church, which includes being centered on the kingdom of God and, quote, excludes violence, considering it unchristian, unscriptural, ineffective, and out of keeping with the dignity of the people. This recognition that violence is inconsistent with human dignity represents a critical insight for the development of Catholic social teaching and praxis, which I'll return to later. Romero also explains that what is absolute for a Christian is, quote, the need to achieve justice according to the norms of the kingdom of God, unquote. Notice he doesn't say the norms of domestic law or international law or even formal church teaching here. It raises a question about what these norms might entail and what style of moral reasoning is more consistent with the kingdom of God. Later in the pastoral letter, Romero reflects on the judgment of the church on violence. He clearly states the church must keep repeating, quote, no to violence, yes to peace. He affirms our faith in the productiveness of peace, or what he calls the peaceful energy of constructive works. He then refers to Pope Paul VI, encouraging the bishops to, quote, guide them in the path of a just peace and help them resist the temptation of violence and hatred, unquote. So notice the phrase path of a just peace. This may be a window into the norms that may be consistent with the kingdom of God. Romero then differentiates types of violence that we've already kind of discussed, including the violence of legitimate self-defense. And he explained that the latter was at the time allowed by the church under 3 particular conditions. I wonder about how he robustly kind of thought about the power of nonviolence. In this letter, he says, for example, use peaceful means first, and then he merely describes nonviolence as a, quote, means of persuasion, unquote. In the fourth pastoral letter, Romero implies something similar, saying, quote, all nonviolent methods should be tried, unquote, before any violent defense, and thus the church urges, quote, every effort for dialogue, reasoning, and persuasion, unquote. Ernesto Valiente suggests that Romero's pastoral letters testify to his personal option for nonviolence if we understand nonviolence as a process that actively opposes violence without using violence, that works to resolve conflicts through just and peaceful alternatives. However, Ernesto also argues that his homilies offer more clarity on his position. For example, in 1977, Romero said, quote, violence is not Christian, not human. Nothing violent can long endure, unquote. 2 years later, Romero said, quote, we do not believe in violence of any sign as the appropriate way to solve problems. So Valiente argues that for Romero, each Christian in the church must be this prolongation of Jesus incarnate in history, entrusted with the same mission of collaborating with God's reconciling reign. Valiente argues that Romero's approach anticipates what he describes as the contemporary Christian peace-building approach. He explains this by quoting Lisa Sol Cahill, who describes peace-building as giving, quote, almost exclusive priority to the positive and nonviolent cultivation of peace, rather than delineating exceptional situations where violence might be justified, unquote. Notably, he also cites the Nonviolence and Just Peace Conference of 2016 in Rome that was focused on centering nonviolence in the church. Part 2, analysis through accompaniment. So in his 4th pastoral letter, he identifies explicitly this apostolate of companionship or accompaniment. This refers to walking with those engaged in political life, whether as advocates, organizations, or political officials. He describes it as providing guidance in accordance with the gospel. It requires discernment, a spirit of sacrifice that will entail risk, and a commitment to this overall plan and communion with the bishops. Romero urged his fellow priests to stand next to campesinos who were being attacked. He says, accompany them, take the same risk they did. Now, someone named Leo Guardado, I don't know if you've heard of him, he explained how the occupations of the cathedral by campesinos helped Romero understand the church's responsibility to accompany and protect. Guardado says, quote, Romero refrained from an uncompromising rebuke, even if such a response seemed justifiable, unquote. Romero modeled a pastoral process. Another occupation began in March 1980 with Romero celebrating a funeral mass for corpses they were watching over. And on March 23rd, in his final radio address before he was killed, Romero makes that appeal to soldiers and police, and he says, quote, each of you is one of us. The peasants you kill are your own brothers and sisters. When you hear a man telling you to kill, remember God's words. Thou shalt not kill. No soldier is obliged to obey a law contrary to the law of God. In the name of God, I command you to stop the repression. Cecilia Gonzalez Andrew describes accompaniment as giving up comfort and accompanying Jesus, who is present in the vulnerable. Accompaniment is sustained encuentro and leads to hope. Ada Maria Esasi Diaz explains, entering en la lucha, into the struggle, this dynamic of accompaniment interrupts the cruelty or cycle of abandonment with the power of liberation. Thus, accompaniment is a sacramental act that enables Jesus' Eucharistic presence. Thinking of that term, accompagnamiento, from the last presentation. In Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis invites us to go beyond these theoretical discussions to gain insight and to, quote, touch the wounded flesh of victims. Indeed, he says, let us look at all the civilians whose killing was considered collateral damage. Let us ask the victims themselves. Let us think of the refugees and displaced, the mothers who lost their children, boys and girls maimed or deprived of their childhood. Let us hear their stories. Look at reality through their eyes. In this way, we will be able to grasp the abyss of evil at the heart of war. Nor will it trouble us to be deemed naive to choosing peace. End quote. So the general trajectory of what Francis seemed to be doing amid various wars was to shift the world's gaze. A shift modeled by Jesus toward the practice of accompaniment, with a focus on breaking the dynamic of violence. Accompaniment affirms and admires those who are willing to take a high-risk stand against aggression rather than to be passive, as well as acknowledging these pressure-packed decisions being made about how to resist. Notably, when Jewish groups strategized to violently resist the ruthless Roman military, Jesus modeled accompaniment by leaning away from justifying methods of violent resistance. This is not because Jesus was being condescending to his Jewish community, but because he recognized that such an approach would significantly harm those he intimately loved, as well as other parties to the conflict. Thus, it seems that accompaniment is also not about justifying methods of war, and enabling dynamics of violence to perpetuate and spread. Romero's pastoral approach to the church, to violence, nonviolence, and centering accompaniment seems to invite us in a similar direction, especially when read in light of Pope Francis and contemporary developments. In this logic, Romero distinctly says, quote, "The church does not approve or justify bloody revolution and crisis of hatred, but neither can it condemn them while it sees no attempt to remove the causes that produce the ailment in our society," unquote. In other words, accompaniment is saying, I hear you, I'm with you, this is or was a horrible and difficult situation. We can find a way through. How can we most likely break this dynamic of dehumanization and violence? What might lean us toward a more sustainable, just peace? Part 3. I'll now consider the implications of such accompaniment to the contemporary Christian discourse around legitimate defense. And in short, I argue that a posture of accompaniment implies centering of active nonviolence that would shift our focus to defending dignity and alter the style of defense we affirm and spotlight. The style will center practices such as unarmed civilian protection, strategic nonviolent resistance, and nonviolent civilian-based defense. Pope Francis deepened and advanced Christian discourse on active nonviolence, defense, and war. In his 2017 World Day of Peace message, he proclaimed, quote, "Especially in situations of conflict, let us respect this, our deepest dignity, and make active nonviolence our way of life." This is in large part because, quote, "to be true followers of Jesus today includes embracing his teaching about nonviolence," unquote. Francis has taken an even stronger position against war. He not only critiqued war and the arms industry consistently, but also argued there is no just war, and we should no longer even be using such language. At the same time, he acknowledges the legitimacy and principle of some form of defense and the need to stop aggressors. So how to defend and what one is defending is still somewhat a gray and developing area for Francis and Catholic social teaching. Lisa Sol Cahill argues persuasively that killing violates our dignity. We heard that earlier from other speakers, even in the context of what she calls irreducible moral dilemmas. She explains that, quote, "killing is never unambiguously right because even in self-defense, killing violates the inalienable dignity of another human being." She argues that the moral cost should not be denied as, quote, "the killing of even an unjust aggressor still involves an offense against the dignity of human life," unquote. She says, quote, "violence not only violates the dignity of life in the example of Jesus, it is notoriously a unsuccessful way to accomplish lasting peace." Now, it's significant to note that other scholars like Anna Florek-Scheid, who has argued for the moral justification of some wars, similarly acknowledges that, quote, "violence, including killing, harms human dignity." So this inconsistency with human dignity is demonstrated by the recognition of trauma, perpetrator-induced syndrome, moral injury, at times even brain damage to the one who kills another in war. It's also dehumanizing by obstructing empathy, failing to be a gift to others, devaluing the sacred gift of others, and generating an ongoing trauma, not only in the parties involved, but also other community members. So a question is there another way forward that is consistent and congruent with human dignity, and that illuminates the way of Jesus for our human community in accord with the mission of the church? The nonviolent style of defense. The proven nonviolent practices of unarmed civilian protection and nonviolent resistance campaigns, along with the examples of potential nonviolent civilian-based strategies, offer a pragmatic way forward for Catholic praxis of legitimate defense. Robust research has demonstrated the significant effectiveness of unarmed civilian protection, or UCP, in war zones. So how many of you have heard of the Nonviolent Peace Force before? I'll say it again. How many of you heard of the Nonviolent Peace Force?
Our QP studies.
So organizations like the Nonviolent Peace Force in violent community conflicts and cure violence. The research has showed that UCP has provided by Nonviolent Peace Force saves lives, helps communities avoid displacement, enables human rights work and humanitarian aid to be delivered, changes behavior of armed actors, creates space for negotiations, and rehumanizes conflict parties. These deployments have been valuable in extreme situations such as ongoing war. They're in Ukraine right now on the front lines. They've been in Iraq, Myanmar, South Sudan, Palestine, and many others. They provide direct protection and accompaniment to those in immediate danger, such as women seeking firewood or water in South Sudan, where they're consistently attacked by all the different armed actors. Tribal leaders trying to cross territory for negotiations, humanitarian aid workers, children going to school, elderly fleeing military zones, religious minorities, refugees, internally displaced persons, human rights actors, and community organizers. There's a story in South Sudan where there was a UN compound and a lot of South Sudanese were staying there to be protected, and armed actors broke in and they started shooting. About 50 people got killed, and these 14 women and children ran into this mud hut to try to hide. And they had 2 Nonviolent Peace Force officers with them. And these armed actors, 2 or 3 of them, kind of broke into the hut with their long AK-47s and said, "You two out of here. We want these women and children." And Derek and Andreas easily could have just been shot. They didn't have a weapon. They stood up and they said, "We're not leaving. We're humanitarian. We're unarmed. And we're staying with these women and children." And it put these armed actors in a moment of decision, and they were struck and surprised, and they backed off. They came back 2 more times with the same demand, same response, and these women and children survived that particular attack. So it's just one example that kind of raises the questions of what's this power, what's this dynamic that's happening with UCP. The value and effectiveness of nonviolent resistance campaigns compared to violent resistance has also been increasingly demonstrated and can serve as a core component of nonviolent defense. So Erica Chenoweth, Maria Stephan have gathered research on the effectiveness of nonviolent resistance campaigns against the aggression and injustice of external occupiers and dictators and communities seeking self-determination. So for example, the research demonstrates that nonviolent resistance was twice as effective compared to violent resistance in removing dictators and ending occupation from 1900 to 2006. So it was about over 300 different cases that Kevin referenced earlier. And it has been 3 times more effective than violent resistance campaigns over the last decade. Further, successful nonviolent resistance campaigns are 10 times more likely to lead to durable democracy, even against the rare times a violent campaign seems to be successful in attaining its political objectives. And even unsuccessful nonviolent campaigns are 4 times more likely to lead to durable democracy compared to an apparently successful violent campaign. So even when violent campaign appears successful in the short term, it is almost 2 times more likely to backslide into authoritarian regime or civil war, along with much higher rates of military coups, massive political corruption, and other types of structural and cultural violence. Further, the research shows that warfare, including defensive war, has a poor track record David Cochran explains that most armed conflicts leave both sides worse off than before. He says over the past century, civilians account for the vast majority of deaths. Warfare typically sets a country's GDP and trade levels back decades and produces huge spikes in poverty. Closely related and at times overlapping with nonviolent resistance is a particular mode of organizing called nonviolent civilian-based defense or social defense. This generally refers to a community or society using a broad set of strategic forms of nonviolent non-cooperation to defend against a large-scale aggressor. This type of defense normally refers to defense against an invasion, such as by an external actor, or defense against internal military operations, such as a coup or a swath of federal armed agents. The scholarship has demonstrated how a pattern of examples of usually spontaneous nonviolent civilian-based defense against the aggression of invasion, such as Czechoslovakia in 1968 against the Soviet Union, Denmark in the early 40s against the Germans, or against military coups, offer a sign of the potential for transforming national defense strategies, especially if we prepare and train and invest. So you can think of other examples like indigenous communities defending to protect the Amazon, or Standing Rock here in the US. Now, just one example, when the Soviets invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968, the political and military leadership decided not to violently resist. Yet many civilians spontaneously refused to cooperate with the Soviet troops. Actions included strikes, refusing supplies to invading troops, cutting off airport services, blocking trains, switching radio signals, removing house numbers to protect leaders, undermining troop loyalty through fraternization, etc. This became a critical defense movement that generated key immediate political concessions and cultivated the community networks and skills for a more complete liberation from the Soviets in the 1980s. Some countries today, like Lithuania, have formally integrated training in nonviolent civilian-based defense into their overall strategy. So in turn, the trajectory of Romero's focus on accompaniment and centering human dignity offers a path for the development of Catholic praxis on the how, or the style of defense, that is to focus on nonviolent resistance, unarmed protection, and nonviolent civilian-based defense. So one additional implication to kind of conclude of Romero for legitimate defense entails the type of moral reasoning the church might focus on and turn toward. His pastoral approach of accompaniment resonates well with just peace moral reasoning. This is one of your handouts. Just Peace focuses on moral guidance and practical norms for one, engaging conflict constructively, breaking cycles of violence, and building sustainable peace. I noticed how Romero utilized some Just Peace reasoning even without naming it as such. For example, he emphasizes sustaining spiritual disciplines like discernment and forgiveness, reflexivity by keeping our means consistent with our ends, specifically the gospel or the kingdom of God, human dignity, such as violence being inconsistent with our sacred dignity, and robust civil rights or civil society and human rights, such as the right to organize, and economic justice, such as the church of the poor and the challenge to institutionalized violence. So Jose Enriquez back here has written a Just Peace approach on El Salvador a few years ago, which is really great. So in sum, I described Romero's approach to violence and then analyzed his approach through his understanding and practice of accompaniment. This turns the focus to walking with and breaking cycles of violence rather than morally justifying violence or war. The implications of such accompaniment to today's Christian discourse around legitimate defense suggest this focus on defending dignity and a shift in style of defense and a resonance with Just Peace moral reasoning.
It's such an honor to be with you this afternoon. Many thanks to the organizers of this conference. This is a really special community, and I'm really glad to be able to share with you. And in these remarks, I'm going to focus on how Archbishop Oscar Romero is received, remembered, and actively mobilized by members of Movimiento Cosecha, which is a Latin American immigrant-led movement here in the United States. This is a part of a broader project of engaged research and collaboration with Cosecha. In our 2021 research agreement, I committed to provide a theological interpretation of the movement. And so it is a real honor to share this with you. And as Bill Kavanaugh said yesterday, I really am not a Romero scholar, and it is the members of the movement and their embodied theological categories, the language that they have used, that brings me into this space. So I look forward to your feedback about how that works or doesn't work with Romero scholarship. Tim has already mentioned the name of this book project, Mobilizing the Dead, Migrant-Led Movements in the Crucified Body. So in this panel, we're gathered to discuss paths of violence and nonviolence. While Black and Brown immigrants, and especially undocumented immigrants, are blatantly targeted by the carceral state today, some Cosecha friends would nevertheless begin by reminding us that 16th, 17th, and 18th century colonial violence is not in the distant past, and sculpts the conditions of possibilities today that these members and friends suffer. Colonial divisions of humanity live on in the racialized enmity, denigration, and exclusion on the landscape of enclosure of bodies enforced by the US security state, they say. Today, most blatantly through ICE. As one Cosecha member who chose the name Rutilio stated, when he bypassed all the pleasantries when I arrived to his apartment in 2022. He said, "I've been looking forward to telling you all about how we have to organize in order to survive." Now, Rutilio, again, is a pseudonym, and he was planning to be here. The plan was for us to do this presentation together, but he suffered an injury at work. He's a construction worker. And so he is not able to be here, but I want to name him and honor him, as largely this is written in conversation with him. In Cosecha, the language used to talk about politics and the language used to talk about God are mutually constitutive and refract each other. That's Luke Brotherton's term, but it is very much true of Cosecha specifically. For members of this movement, Oscar Romero is not merely a historical martyr to be admired or romanticized. He is an active participant in present struggle to live more fully. So here I'm going to synthesize how Romero is received by Cosecha members as a critical agent in political and spiritual uprising against the forces of dismemberment. So I'm going to talk about despair of dismemberment, and then pulling the dead free, and then arising, agotamiento, remembering the body, and then I'll close by a note on extending Romero, or how they extend Romero. To understand how Romero is received, we must first locate ourselves in the lived reality of those receiving them. And in this community, that less needs to be said than in other spaces. Many Cosecha members experience their reality through the lens of descuartamiento, that is Rutilio's term, dismemberment. This term and synonyms used shed light on the social and political death experienced by members. Rutilio is, again, a Cosecha member who lives in New Jersey. He was forced to migrate to the US due to, and I quote, inability to survive economically in the aftermath of El Salvador's civil war. He frames this forced migration as desintegración. The conditions that cosecha members face in the US, living under constant threat of detention and deportation, and the factors that drove them to the US, have together deprived them of meaningful interpersonal connections that constituted their relational understanding of the self, rendering them what we have come to call the socially dead. Social death is in the phenomenological sense that members were severed from social worlds in ways that dismantled person's sense of self and reality. This term social death is, of course, originally from Orlando Patterson, but it's been taken up by scholars of migration. The denial, expulsion, and exclusion on a landscape of confinement places undocumented members in what Mbembe calls political death. And so this is Xochitl, and she's one of the early cosecha organizers who was detained and in detention for months. She now is out, but this would be an example of what has led us to think about existence in social and political death. Rutilio is an expert in what he calls Christian political thought and mística, and what others would call Salvadoran liberation theology. He is the person, again, who first used the term descuartamiento, dismemberment. Sitting in his third-story apartment in a mid-sized city in New Jersey, a portrait of Romero hanging prominently in the living room above the refrigerator before us, he told me that the so-called security forces dismembered his nuclear family, extended family, then his parish community, and eventually the base communities his father worked with and society. By doing so, he invited analysis of lived reality and the forces that have torn apart and continue to tear apart as theological truth, as you all know. Over the course of several days that we spent together in the summer of 2022, he described the violence of state separating families and scattering communities in the United States, as in the Salvadoran context of violence of state separated families and communities, and as crucifixion was a political act of terror and form of public execution used to violently dismember Jesus's body, and that was expected to dismember Jesus's community of followers. It is within this profound despair of dismemberment that Oscar Romero made his presence among the organizing immigrant community. This takes us to the second part, pulling free, Romero and anamnestic participation. I mentioned to Sarah and Jorge that this presentation was going to sound like a response to what they introduced at the beginning of the day. You can hear it. Cosecha members do not view the past as static. They engage in a relational practice of resistance that I call harrowing. It mobilizes hope by mobilizing the dead. To harrow is to disturb and break apart hard ground with an agricultural implement of the same name, a harrow. To prepare for seeding so that plants can grow into a plentiful harvest. The agricultural implement inspired the early Christian tradition, affirming that between the crucifixion and resurrection, Jesus descended to the abode of the dead, harrowing hell, liberating the lost and the just. Those are the agricultural and Christian origins of my use of the term harrowing. Consider again Rutilio, who deliberately adopted his pseudonym in honor of Rutilio Grande, who trained his father as a catechist, and who, of course, as he talked to me about, whose assassination impacted Romero, waking him up, he's told me. He underscored the significance by pointing out the portrait of Romero hanging prominently in his living room where we sat. This is not decoration. Grande and Romero are still our priests. We still need them. I still need them, he said plainly. Selecting the pseudonym Rutilio and hanging the photograph of Romero are harrowing acts. For the cosecha member, Rutilio, Cosecha fights against oblivion, fights to cross the abyssal line, to use Balthazar's terms for harrowing hell, and pulls the biologically dead free, bringing them into the present where they play an active role. By bringing Romero into the present, Rutilio ensures that he and other members of the socially dead, and he's referred to himself as someone who needed to re-exist. That's a part of where I'm drawing, why I'm using this language, are accompanied by the biologically dead in what must be acknowledged as a dynamic, reciprocal, and collaborative transgenerational relationship. And here we could also draw on the work of Sean Copeland as she thinks about some of that relationality transgenerationally. This practice diverges from Western academic theology, even Johann Baptist Metz's concept of dangerous memory of victims, because there, the victims of history are subjects. Dangerous memories consist of the victim's plans, hopes, and goals. In Cosecha, Romero is received not as a subject of memory, but as an agent, through what we might call critical animistic participation, extending Metz's animistic memory. Rutilio's memories transport him so that he is truly present at Rutilio Grande's assassination, Oscar Romero's assassination, Jesus' crucifixion, and likewise makes Jesus present in Rutilio's dismemberment now. Grande and Romero enable this Cosecha member's constructive action under duress. Moving on to the next section, I will arise in my people, agglutination and uprising. On a granular level, how exactly does Romero's agency manifest in the movement today? One way is as a catalyst for what Rutilio calls agglutination, or unification. So in El Salvador, Rutilio, the Cosecha member, was also a catechist like his father. And he learned about the mystical process of agglutination in that context. I asked him what he meant by agglutination, and he defined it as a unification of the parts through organizing. It is how one can survive and even thrive amidst the onslaught of forces that dismember bodies. In a ritual of sharing at a 2022 Cosecha Congreso, an annual gathering of active members, this was March 31st through April 3rd, Rutilio and his wife Rosa placed a picture of Romero on the table. The whole point of showing you this is for you to be able to see the picture, but you can't actually, which is too bad. It's right here. I promise. The picture is a physical manifestation of his action toward unification of members by Cosecha member Rutilio. Rutilio, the movement member, was bringing together other members, Romero, Rutilio Grande, the original one, their ideas and his own hard-won insights from participation in base communities and popular movements in El Salvador to form a new body here in the United States, a political movement body. This was, and I'm just going to say very briefly here, what you just saw was a reset, because this was the original formula that was to produce an uprising for the Cosecha movement, but it didn't work. And Cosecha member Rutilio's statement was, an uprising does not happen through a formula. So in our conversations at Cosecha member Rutilio's house, I asked him what it meant to carry forward the leadership that Oscar Romero embodied and amplified. He looked at me, because it seemed like I should have already have figured this out. And then he looked again to the portrait of Romero Maybe I don't have that here. So he just pointed at this and he said, you may have heard about Romero's words. Si me matan, I will rise again. If they kill me, I will arise with my people. And then he was quiet and he looked at me. He is really not afraid to create awkward moments that allow space for someone to figure things out. And what he was doing, what he did really underscored the empirical reality, saying, here we are, we're rising. Romero was received by Cosecha as a prophetic promise that members sacrificially struggle to fulfill under duress, amidst ongoing dismemberment. It is, Rutilio and others insist, a mystical process. It is graced in theological terms. The people at Pueblo, who in recent years organized in the streets and are these days still working behind the scenes to keep each other safe, organize Know Your Rights training, support the community to navigate guardianship as parents are detained and deported, and in other ways besides are reclaiming their agency with the support of the saints and the martyrs who have their hearts and have their backs. According to Rutilio, they are embodying Romero's uprising. Convivio, we also see this in the streets. The reception of Romero is not isolated to living rooms. It is public. It's a political reality. We see this vividly in the context of convivios, a gathering where reflection blends with communal, cultural, pastoral, and protest realities. During a national convergence in DC in 2021, Cosecha members and other immigrant-led groups and allies stood near the National Mall. A leader, Beto, from North Carolina declared, "We're the inheritors of Zapata, Allende, Bolivar, Torres." From the crowd, a woman lifted high a large image of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and someone else called out Romero. In this spontaneous litany of remembrance, the gathered community invoked the presence of Romero alongside leaders of popular struggle, victims of political violence, martyrs, and saints. This is how Romero was received in the streets. He is present in the convivio, sharing life and struggle together with the living. He is a vital part of the transgenerational dimension of the political movement body. With his participation come his gifts, like el sentir de la iglesia, that the body needs to carry and carries forward and shapes movement ethos. Remembering the body. So I'm going to close with 2 points here. First, Romero is received by Cosecha not through a text or not as a relic of the past, but as a vital, active collaborator in the collective constructive agency under duress of struggling and organizing immigrants today. When ICE uses terror and deportation to cause the dismemberment of communities, Cosecha responds with remembering, bringing together the separated, dispersed, and lost members, the fragments, the remnants we heard earlier, to survive and confront global violence. Romero is pulled free from oblivion to participate in this process. For people who have been dismembered, mobilizing is a faithful response to the betrayed Jesus who said, "This is my body broken. Do this, remember me." By drawing Romero into the uprising, Cosecha members remember the dismembered body of Christ, building a political movement body in a messianic register, challenging us to have faith that the dead and the living can rise together amidst persecution, demanding the advent of a new era that we cannot see but may embody through solidarity and articulation in the Spanish sense of the word. Missed that slide. That's a quote. "We are becoming a people, we are becoming a body," is a statement from members. I close with a note on praxis of nonviolence, again, the theme of our panel, that transforms more subtle forms of violence as members work with Romero. So to close, a word on extending Romero. This understanding of Romero as a vital collaborator is a dynamic appropriation of Romero that is also a critical extension of Romero. I mentioned before that it was critical in his participation. The consciousness of colonialism across the Americas with which I began means that an incarnational political theology will be attuned to the Christian entanglements in colonial processes and their afterlives. The image of Romero alongside symbols of other moral traditions and process and ways of knowing from the retreat, you recall the altar up here, suggests a pluralism that was not characteristic of Romero's assumptions or model of social change. Romero's thinking assumes a church that helps to provide national unity. Here I'm going to be drawing heavily on Eduardo Colón Emmerich's in Oscar Romero's theological vision. He shows that the theology of transfiguration that resources Romero's powerful thought mutes, in his terms, other forms of violence. As we studied together in the Romero group earlier last year, Romero released 3 of his 4 pastoral letters on August 6th, the patronal feast day of El Salvador, which is also a celebration of national identity. The day celebrating the Feast of the Transfiguration is also known as the Fiesta del Divino Salvador del Mundo. The historical violence of this day traces back to August 6th, 1456, when news of the Christian victory over the Turks at Belgrade reached Pope, who responded by adding the date to the Western calendar. Modern authors link the names El Salvador and San Salvador to the celebrations, also known as La Fiesta del Divino Salvador del Mundo. According to Colón Emmerich, the Feast of Divino Salvador del Mundo became a touchstone for a national identity which, and I quote, has its origin in Pedro de Alvarado's victory over the indigenous in the early 1500s. Romero follows this interpretation in the naming of El Salvador in ways that, in Colón Emmerich's analysis, limit, and I quote, the scope of Romero's study of the question of violence by muting questions of colonialism, close quote. Sobrino's identification of the destruction of culture as a form of crucifixion that weakens the identity and defenses of a suffering people take on additional significance in light of this omission. And again, I'm referring to Sobrino here, but also working with Colón Emmerich's notions there. By my lights, it underscores Colón Emmerich's estimation that Romero's work is not invalidated by this omission, but it needs to be extended. It needs to be transformed nonviolently, increasing justice and diminishing the embedded violence. And I believe that the praxis of cosecha in drawing Romero into the movement does just this. An incarnational theology rooted in a migrant-led political movement's body's praxis of uprising extends his work through practices of solidarity and articulation, or in English, remembering.
Thank you very much. Those were 2 amazing presentations to close off this day and this, what feels like a month of conversations. I want to start with like a short story. A couple of years ago, the person who would become my wife asked me about the communion of the saints. And I hadn't thought about the communion of the saints since first communion class. So we went to the catechism and read what it said and had a very animated theological discussion. But now with today's presentation by Janna, I figured out a better way to explain this with an example. With today's presentation, with what cosecha is doing, the language of embodiment, this is the community of saints. Cosecha's language of embodiment is crucial to avoid talking about theology or suffering in the abstract. Just like Jesus, who went out and encountered people, the people who are part of cosecha and countless other groups go beyond themselves, their comforts, and their pains to meet the poor and downtrodden. The lived experience that Janna recounts is a great example of the framework that Eli has presented and can truly be considered the community of saints. Wicked violence in both cases starts with being present. Like Pope Francis' example of being a church that goes out, or Romero's calls to fill with the church. The preceding presentation challenges us to move beyond this space of comfort. We're sitting comfortably in our chairs, we've had food, we have a great weather inside and out, to go to those places, to move beyond the comfort to the places that make us uncomfortable, places where we can be with the crucified people. The communion of the saints creates spaces of embodiment where saints and saints in progress, meaning the rest of us, can bring to light violence and injustice and shout that a different world is not only possible, but necessary. To keep the conversation going, I would like to pose one question to each of our presenters. To Eli, it seems to me that the nonviolent styles of defense depend on the oppressors having a working moral compass that can be swayed by a critical mass of opposition. Yet, more and more, it seems our leaders don't have this compass. So what does the framework offer as guidance when morals might not be enough to make structural changes? And to Janna, you mentioned that we need to extend Romero's understanding to mean more pluralistic. You also mentioned examples of other people that are remembered as fighting for justice. But does a non-Catholic approach change the result of this remembering more than just remembering? And now I will say this in Spanish. So Javier doesn't have to suffer through it.
Gracias a Fabio.
Hace un par de años, la persona que se convertiría en mi esposa me preguntó sobre la comunión de los santos. No había pensado en ello desde las clases de primera comunión. Fuimos al catecismo para buscarlo y hablar al respecto. Pero con la presentación de Janna, ahora tengo una mejor manera de explicarlo, con ejemplos concretos. Con el lenguaje de acuerpamiento, tomando el lenguaje que hemos aprendido el día de hoy y que voy a seguir usando, de cosecha es crucial para evitar hablar de teología o del sufrimiento en abstracto. Al igual que Jesús, que salió y se encontró con las personas, aquellas personas que forman parte de cosecha, y de muchas otras personas y organizaciones, salen de sí mismos, de sus condiciones, de sus comunidades, de sus comodidades y de sus dolores, para encontrarse con el pobre y el oprimido. La experiencia vivida que relata Janna es un gran ejemplo del marco que Eli ha presentado y puede considerarse verdaderamente como la comunidad o la comunión de los santos. Romper la violencia en ambos casos comienza con estar presentes. Al igual que el ejemplo del Papa Francisco de ser una iglesia en salida, o el llamado de San Romero a ser y sentir con la iglesia, las presentaciones anteriores nos desafían a ir más allá de este espacio de comunidad hacia lugares que nos incomodan, lugares donde podemos estar con el pueblo crucificado. La comunión de los santos, entendida como acuerpamiento, crea espacios de encarnación donde los santos en progreso, que somos todos nosotros, podemos sacar a la luz la violencia y las injusticias y proclamar que otro mundo no solo es posible, sino también necesario. Para continuar la conversación, me gustaría plantear una pregunta a cada uno de nuestros ponentes. Para Eli, me parece que los modelos de defensa no violenta dependen de que los opresores tengan un compás moral que funciona, que puede ser influenciado por una masa crítica de oposición. Sin embargo, cada vez más parece que nuestros líderes no tienen este compás. ¿Qué orientaciones ofrecen los modelos cuando la moral no es suficiente para generar cambios estructurales? Para Janna, mencionó que necesitamos ampliar la comprensión de Romero para que sea más pluralista. También mencionó otras personas que son recordadas en la lucha por la justicia. En este sentido, ¿qué cambios cree que hay en cuanto a la comprensión de remembering, para personas que son no católicas?
Yeah. Thank you. Appreciate your reflections. This is a really important question, and there is a pretty robust response that is possible. So first of all, the logic of strategic nonviolent resistance is not dependent on changing the mind or the heart of the adversary. And I'll give you some examples. So the research that Chenoweth and Stefan did, most of these examples of nonviolent resistance occurred in authoritarian contexts. Right? They're rarely, or certainly not only, in democratic contexts. And what they have found is that the structure of the society, whether it's authoritarian or democratic, matters little in the success rates of the nonviolent resistance. What is more determinative is how well the resistance reduces or diminishes what are called sources of power. So in the literature, there are 6 sources of power as one frame: numbers of humans that support the regime, people with key skills and knowledge like government, judges, media, material resources, so kind of money, communications, infrastructure, intangible resources like the cultural leaders, including religious leaders, authority, and then sanctions. Sanctions is the ability of the regime to enforce their injustice through usually police or military or judges. So the resistance movements that can diminish any of those 6 sources of power, that can build broad-based coalitions, another key factor, that can generate about 3.5% of the population being consistently engaged, and particularly in authoritarian situations, can generate a degree or pattern of defections from the regime. Those are the key markers or indicators to determine the success of nonviolent resistance. We can look at examples like Charles Taylor, a major dictator in Liberia in 2003. He was taken down by a women's-led nonviolent movement. Lema Bowie won the Nobel Peace Prize. It's a great documentary called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. Milosevic in Serbia in 1999, he was involved in ethnic cleansing in Kosovo, indicted by the ICC. He was taken down by a young adult youth movement called Otpor. They diminished his sources of power. He couldn't maintain the injustice. He didn't have a change of heart or mind. Marcos in the Philippines, there's a number of examples of authoritarian leaders losing control because of wild strategy, and strategy is going to be flexible, right? If you're just doing protests and you start getting shot, you don't want to just keep doing protests, right? You got to broaden out the strategies. So I think those would be some things to consider. The research is why civilian resistance works. If you don't know the book, there's a number of other things that have come out since then. But I'll leave it.
Entonces, le dijo gracias por la pregunta. Quiere destacar la idea de que la lógica de este movimiento no violento no necesariamente es el cambio del corazón de la persona o el cambio de mente de la persona, del adversario, concretamente. Apunta de una investigación de Chenoweth que en situaciones de autoritarismo, sí, perdón. Lo que es más importante es reducir fuentes de poder, y los fuentes de poder se describen o se definen con cosas como gente, dinero, recursos, además que líderes, incluyendo líderes religiosos, y además que la fuerza física, las sanciones, lo que él dice sanciones, pero la fuerza física del gobierno, del Estado o del adversario, deberíamos decir, ¿verdad? Sí. You don't know Spanish, you know, estos movimientos de resistencia que pueden hacer esto, y cita este número de 3.5% de la población tienen que estar realmente involucrados en estos movimientos para que sean eficaces. Y realmente esto, más que la pregunta de Fabio, que era más bien como que el compás moral, son las cosas importantes.
Thank you. I think I would differentiate between extending Romero so that he's pluralistic which is what I heard you asking about. And what we're trying to do here, which is to provide a normative intercultural reflection on a pluralistic movement that composed of members, many of whom identify as Christian, but not all. And so I would say I'm trying to do the latter, not the former. And this idea of an intercultural approach is necessary given the way we're situated as persons involved in this project. And specifically, it emerges from the method that we're using, which is most closely aligns with Ada Maria Isaza Diaz's notion of dialogue as research and praxis. And there she specifically talks about the way in which members of a community, what they can do is to commit to be in dialogue together amidst great difference. And so with Cosecha members, that is what they asked me to do, was to enter in and do theologizing as a member of this community that holds difference to you.
Do you want to do it? Or you want me to do it?
I can try.
I have notes if you want me to do it. Yeah, okay. Entonces, no, Janna está diciendo lo que está haciendo ella no necesariamente es mover Romero mover Romero a una noción plurista, sino más bien Romero significa más como una normativa intercultural en un movimiento pluralista, ¿no? Entonces no significa Romero es pluralista, sino en este movimiento cómo se usa Romero como una norma, ¿verdad? Sí. Y luego cita a Isaza Díaz y me emocioné un poquito, entonces no capté todo, pero que dijiste, pero que Isaza Díaz tiene esta idea de investigación como un diálogo entre estas comunidades pluralistas, ¿no? Entonces, Janna, lo que ella está haciendo es entrando a esa comunidad para poder dialogar y conversar y hacer teología dentro de esa comunidad plural.
Porque ese fue lo que dijimos como comunidad. Miembros de Cosecha dijeron que querían que yo escribiera como miembro en diálogo. Entonces, por eso mi orientación.
We got a little bit of time. Falta poco tiempo, so si hay preguntas breves, a short comment or question. Yeah.
So this is a comment, and it's like a footnote to your presentation, Janna. So it's not a criticism, it's a suggestion, because as an old Mets fan, it's been so heartwarming to me to hear him come up. And I know if Baptiste was here, that's what his friends called him, he would be too. But and so I'm just suggesting this as a way to, I hope, continue to use his rich reflections. And that is when he talks about memory, he always puts it together with narrative and solidarity. Like at the end of the book, he even hyphenates them. And he does, he says, memory and narrative can no more be practical categories without solidarity than solidarity can give full expression to the mystical humanizing form of Christianity without memory. And so I think this notion of solidarity, again, it may not do what you're looking for, but I do think it might be helpful just to keep in mind that for him, they all go together. And the other thing that solidarity means for him is hope, because he'll often talk about solidaristic hope.
Yeah.
And so he's always asking the question, with whom do we hope? And he thinks part of what memory does is it problematizes with whom we hope. And Fabio, just thinking of your presentation, as early as 1971, he was writing about the communion of the saints as an indispensable mystical political praxis. So it's not a criticism, and
Please
it's just
criticize.
no, it's not. I just think, but I think you get the full import of what he means by memory if you keep in mind that a narrative for him is about transforming our imagination, because, and here I always think of Willie Jennings Brown book, we have a diseased social imagination, and narrative so the three of them always go together. And I think that he wouldn't be criticizing either, he would be smiling. So again.
Thank you. And
Yeah.
a question that I would have for you then would be, my understanding of his anthropology is that he would be distinct from an anthropology that is articulated as a relational notion that is transgenerational. And so my understanding has been that it is more precisely Metz's anthropology that would keep him from understanding, let's say, Romero as an agent, the way I understand Cosecha members understanding the biological dead as agents.
Yeah, well, I don't want to dominate this conversation but we could talk more, because I think he would resist the idea that he has an anthropology. I think that's one way he broke from Ronner.
Mhm.
It's really important to remember he's always writing a practical fundamental theology. The categories prove themselves in terms of the praxis, which for him is always mystical political, that go together with them. And so I think even the idea that, quote unquote, he has an anthropology, he would push back against that. And now again, your broader question about how he might understand that remains. And he was always one to say his context was determinative for him. And as many of you in this room know, for him, it was the context of what does it mean to be a German Catholic after Auschwitz. And he would be the first one to say, that's my context. And that's how it sort of determines the way he uses these categories. But I think what he would say is the categories transcend the context in the sense of, because they don't define an anthropology, they define what he calls a sort of parameters for praxis, for sort of discovering the way as you go along. So
Thank you.
Yeah, we'll see.
sorry, Mira. I owe you this.
Están hablando de un teólogo, Johann Baptist Metz, que es un teólogo alemán, pero Matt quería aportar la idea de que, Matt, you can also do it. Do you want to do it or do you want me to do it? Oh, okay.
It'll be a lot faster.
Ya, entonces la memoria, Metz tiene estas categorías de memoria, narrativa y solidaridad. Y en el último capítulo de su libro que Matt tradujo del alemán al inglés, tiene esta idea de cómo memoria, solidaridad y narrativa siempre están juntos. Y siempre se hace esta pregunta de con quién esperamos, ¿no? Con quién estamos esperando cuando decimos que esperamos algo, ¿no? Que tenemos esperanza. Entonces es últimamente una esperanza, o es al fin del día una esperanza solidaria, que tiene mucho que ver. Entonces también destaca la idea de que Metz también habla de la comunión de los santos, que Fabio habló de eso, como parte de esta narrativa, de esta memoria, perdón, y que la narrativa realmente lo que nos hace, lo que nos posibilita es el cambio de la imaginación, una imaginación corrupta. Janna le respondió que para ella lo que ella había entendido de Metz es que su antropología no le permite tener esta idea de solidaridad transgeneración, o sea, transtiempo, ¿no? O sea, lo que ella cita de Sean Copeland es que sí se puede tener esta solidaridad entre generaciones, o sea, con la gente que ya no vive, ¿no? Y entonces en eso me parece que la palabra en español agente es más o menos lo que hace el trabajo de agent en inglés. Tiene hay sutilidades que no son iguales, pero que Romero en Metz no puede tener este poder, ¿no? De ser como vivo. Y Matt le respondió que no es tanto su antropología y que quizás hay un problema en incluso decir que Metz tiene una antropología como lo tendría alguien como Ronner, pero que estas categorías vienen de un contexto, pero también estas categorías nos permiten tener como un plan de praxis. ¿Ya?
Your translation.
She knows, she'll collect.
No, that's it.
David had one too. Can we both do questions and then we'll see?
Why don't we pose 2 questions and then they can go ahead.
So Janna's presentation is reminding me of something that came up quite a bit as we were writing with Lau and Rosy and Teresa about and this is something that's come up for the working group quite a bit too, of actualizando a Romero, or updating Romero, or bringing him into dialogue with contemporary, or as Hema said yesterday, not so contemporary issues. And I'm starting to think, or we started to talk we were like, should we do a soteriology of like what's going on, or what would it mean to look at Romero en clave neumatológico? So we think about Romero as like this kind of Jesuan, like a mártir jesuánico, or like with Monseñor Romero, Dios pasó por El Salvador. We think of Romero as like a Christological figure. But when Romero dies and is resurrected in his people, he also becomes like a pneumatological figure. So if we're talking about history and updating Romero as a historical figure in movements, in uprisings, in from a perspective of coloniality, from a perspective of feminism, Teresa said in her November 20th presentation, like Romero was not feminist and couldn't have been feminist, and yet feminist movements find inspiration in some of the same logics that he was attentive to. And it's not just an updating of Romero, just like the body of the church isn't just an updating of Jesus's body. So when we think in a pneumatological key, how do we think about Romero as a Christ figure whose body is remembered pneumatologically today? So that was something we had talked about in our group, and your comments at the end, especially about the Transfiguration as like a colonial celebration that he held very dear. What does it mean to be inspired by Romero then in anti-colonial work? It has to be pneumatological, I think. Pensar en clave neumatológico, o sea, muchas veces hablamos de Romero como un figura cristológico, pero en estos movimientos otros o que van más allá que él, o que él en su momento histórico no pudiera haber entendido por ser que nazareno, hijo de un carpintero, ¿cómo podemos decir que Romero inspira diferentes movimientos feministas o que Romero inspira el movimiento cosecha? Si era tan devoto a la fiesta de la transfiguración que, como Janna y Colonemeric dicen, tiene como categorías coloniales, pero tiene que ser entonces como una hermenéutica neumatológica. El acuerpamiento de Romero o la resurrección de Romero lo pone en clave neumatológico, no solo cristológico. Nos da como más libertad de decir la continuidad y la descontinuidad de él. It speaks differently of his continuity and discontinuity contemporarily.
Do you want to do one comment?
Sure, yeah, and a question very briefly. So thank you both. My question is for Eli and Laurel. And this is building on other conversations that we've had throughout the conference on violence. I can understand the desire to disassociate defense, legitimate defense, from just war as a way of trying to think about creative processes of nonviolence, right? But I'm wondering, is there a way to disentangle violence from force? Because it seems to me that force is intrinsic to defense in any form, whether it's self-defense or defense of the neighbor. And it seems that you clearly want to preserve the concept of defense. But why can't we talk about force as being something good? When you think about Gandhi and Satyagraha, right? Like truth has its own force. So not just the force of physical action, like in things like strikes, right? Boycotts. I mean, these are acts that tend to cause a great deal of discomfort, civil disobedience in society, right? Very forceful kinds of actions. And words as well, right? Words that have the power of force. And so I'm just wondering, is that something that would be amenable to, and even in the cases that you gave, right, of the different kinds of nonviolent movements, even violence against property seems to be sometimes permissible in some cases. So just if you could expand on that.
Yeah, si hay una manera yo entiendo que es importante para distinguir el defenso con la guerra justa, ese concepto, porque la guerra justa tiene violencia que tiene muchas consecuencias. Pero hay una manera de distinguir, o si es bien para distinguir la violencia con la fuerza y usar la palabra de fuerza de una manera más positiva, porque hablamos como Mahatma Gandhi hablaba de Satyagraha, que era una fuerza de la verdad, y las palabras tienen una fuerza. Entonces quiero saber si hay una manera de hablar de un estilo de no violencia que usa fuerza.
I think we're over time, right?
Laurel's comments for the stands.
Yes, that's,
Yeah.
that feels.
Yeah, and so if you have a quick.
Yeah, I think this is a crucial move, is to disentangle the concept of violence from force. And you have good examples like Gandhi talks about satyagraha as clinging to truth or truth forward for soul force. Romero actually describes nonviolence as a moral force. Maybe more to that as well. But I do think this is one of the cultural challenges we face, is that we tend to, when we use the language of force, it tends to be associated with some kind of strategy or posturing. And then that makes nonviolence look like it doesn't have force or it doesn't have power, and it's more easily kind of dismissed or bracketed. So I do think it's critical to disassociate those. Anytime I have a student say, well, it's force or nonviolence, I'm always like, it's violent force or nonviolent force. And like those are the real particular options. And this shows up in our political culture, right? When you think of people like George Floyd being killed or Michael Brown being killed, and the discourse is, well, the police may have used excessive force, right? But they rarely get described as being violent, right? Because it's serving particular interests when people like the police or the military are described as people using force rather than actors of violence. Whether that's justified or not, just describing it as violence is, I think, important. So, yeah, I would agree with that.
Entonces está de acuerdo que hay que hacer esta desconexión entre fuerza y violencia, que Romero describe la no violencia como una fuerza moral, entonces hay fuerza ahí, pero es que siempre hay, y quería destacar que siempre hay esta conexión entre fuerza y violencia en la manera en la cual hablamos culturalmente, y usa el ejemplo de la policía, por ejemplo, cuando matan a gente en las calles de Estados Unidos. Usó dos ejemplos de afroamericanos, pero yo le agrego también a todo Alex Petty y Rene Good, que hablamos de ellos como usando una fuerza excesiva, pero no decir que son violentos, ¿no? Entonces, como que la gramática ahí de usar violencia contra fuerza sirve intereses públicos y intereses políticos.
Muchas gracias.